so that Bianca can sit. So we don't need a picture, so I'm going to, so you'll be moderating from, unless you want to moderate from there, but what is easier?
So you will do your presentations from the
No.
podium? No? You will, should we all sit down or should I sit
It's up to you, whichever you prefer.
Very good. I see you from the end easy functions. Yes. I love the button. I love the drip. Very jealous.
Yeah, you want one?
I think, we've all got one.
If you're participating, you got
Yes.
So that's why I'll put this way.
You got too early.
Oh, I'm ready.
No, like this one, you just move this one there and you sit.
The good thing is that we give it before the take for granted your.
Mira, should we present from here?
It's gonna be good.
Or from here?
I don't.
You don't like this one?
We
I
have
know.
only 2-3 minutes. No? So
So you also like to present. Okay, so we all present from here.
Yeah.
So you can basically like take this seat here.
1, 2, 1. Ah, this is working.
And then we're going to sit next to you.
Are we not going to?
It looks like a poster for the Embassy Partnership.
This so people can see the logo.
Yeah.
All right.
And Bianca can be seen from there.
We can mute this one. We can mute it. We are not listening to this.
Yeah. Yes.
All right. Is it anything you need?
No, I think it looks good for now. We just need one more.
I'm in discussion with one.
she's on her way.
She's on her way. We have a couple of minutes. That's fine.
If you need anything, be there.
Yeah.
Trying to get to Christmas.
All right. All the best.
Thank you.
Yeah, we did. We did the last one. So now they said, okay, we will. So we said, let's stop, but let's. And I text quickly because okay, very busy. Everybody gets busy. But yeah. Other than that, you're thematic program.
I think maybe I'll put it here. This one.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
You can actually move this a bit here.
No,
So
that's it.
it's
She's going to be 2 minutes late. She's rushing over now.
Yeah. I think that Andreas I cannot see him, so let's start. Plus, here at least we have
Okay. Well, I'll let you do it. Andres.
No, so sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, because you're not working.
Yeah. Yes. So I can take them and send them to you.
I think we need
yeah. No. I think our comms person is going to come as well.
Yeah.
I bribed them.
You made them
I bribed them. So, hold on. So, Andreas is here, and it's you, so you're here, and then it's Neha, and it's myself. Yes. Oh, you can put it on, I put it on, but it's a magnet, by the way. It's a very strong magnet, so it doesn't ruin your clothes.
Good afternoon. Okay, now it's working. Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this event called Climate and Development, Aligning Environmental, Economic and Social Development Goals. And this session will explore how climate finance contributes to the achievement of other sustainable development goals, including environmental, economic and social development goals. This is an event with and by the evaluation units of the 4 multilateral climate funds, namely the Adaptation Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund. As you know, the 4 climate funds work a lot together on complementarity and coherence. There have been many events this week on various topics. The heads of the 4 funds have signed a joint declaration on how to enhance access and increase impact this Monday. And we also have, for the very first time at this COP, a joint pavilion, which is actually on the 2nd floor of this very building. So I invite you all to also join us at our pavilion, where you can meet the representatives of all the funds. Today's event, we will really focus on the evaluation units and the evaluation studies and all the incredible learning that comes from that. And we have 4 great speakers on our panel. We have first Andreas Reumann, who is the head of the independent evaluation unit of the Green Climate Fund. We have Neeraj Kumar Negi, the Senior Evaluations Officer at the Global Environment Facility. We have Neha Sharma, who is the Head of Evaluation and Learning at the Climate Investment Funds. Sorry, let me... Evaluation and Learning Lead at the Climate Investment Fund. And we have Vladislav or Vlad Arnudov, from the Adaptation Fund Technical Evaluation Reference Group, AF Turk. And he's the Secretariat Coordinator and Senior Evaluation Officer. My name is Bianca Kretschmer. I am a climate change specialist at the Adaptation Fund, and I will be your moderator for today. And at the very outset, I would also like to thank the NDC Partnership for hosting us at their pavilion with this event. So, the 4 speakers will now share with us findings from their evaluations, and they will share why assessing and evaluating climate interventions is different to other types of evaluations. They will also share what evidence they have on the links between climate and development goals and how to better align climate finance with other sustainable development goals. And finally, we will also have some time for a Q&A and some panel discussion where we can discuss how to overcome some of the existing challenges in measuring development and climate impacts. With this, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Andreas, and I would like to ask all of you in your presentations to answer the question of whether there is a strong link between climate and development and what evidence you have found in your programs and in your evaluations on how climate finance contribute to those. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Once again, great to be here. It's a great pleasure to see this work here with the NDC partnership. It's really important to bring the climate funds together. This is a great example of learning together and creating lessons learned from our respective works. I had a few slides just for helping some of the colleagues to better understand some of my reasoning. But let me just start by saying the GCF from its perspective, so the Green Climate Fund from its perspective, has looked at the question of development and climate finance from a very comprehensive view. So as it states in its governing instrument, the fund aims to promote a paradigm shift, the very much needed paradigm shift that we need, given that we don't have enough finance to address all the needs, the climate needs in the countries, through a paradigm shift in these low emission and climate resilient development pathways. So with this, it made a very strong first foot forward to say, okay, we want to show that we think as climate, we think from a GCF's perspective as a climate fund that looks at development and climate interventions together. So that's the first thing first. I know we don't have any slides. Don't look so much up there. It's fine. We'll get to it. So that's been the first introduction. Then the next step that we have from there is to say, okay, if we have this, how do we get climate finance up and running, right? And the GCF has an incredible array of an origination process, an incredible array of different facilities as well as different programs that could be used in order to bring about climate projects. So now you see here the first slide that's telling you a little bit about how the GCF is thinking about finance. On the left-hand side, you see, as I just said, we really are about bringing a comprehensive view to the question of how to promote paradigm shifts in these development pathways, and that's how we define climate. When we look on the right-hand side there, you'll see how the GCF is then trying to make sense of the different trade-offs that we need to deal with. And that is done through the investment framework. So we do investments based on certain investment criteria, which includes there on the right-hand side, anything from impact over again to paradigm shift to the question of sustainability and other things, as well as looking at the portfolio targets that we have. And here, one thing to say here is that the GCF has put it at its forefront of the work, a 50-50 balance between mitigation and adaptation. So it looks, again, from a very comprehensive view, what are we bringing to the table to look at both climate resilient pathways, but also low emission pathways for the mitigation part. Another important thing here to notice is the question that all of these finance decisions cannot be done with sufficient frameworks that are underpinning the work that we do. Again, here there's frameworks and policies such as the question of grant equivalent. So the fund has set out to create that paradigm shift, both by public as well as by private sector finance. Again, without grant equivalent, this would not be possible, because some of the financial products that the private sector would bring to the table can't be explained differently and required at grant equivalent terms. So this is, I'll leave you with this. So just the learning that we have from that is, this is how the fund is being set up. Now, it would be strange as an evaluator to be so positive in a presentation. So now let me go on to some of the findings. Next slide, please. The findings that we have. So when we looked at the funds and the fund's perspective, and we just finished our second performance review, what we found is an array of different learnings. Let me only bring 3 groups of learnings to you. One is from the performance perspective with regards to institutional structure, the question of access, and the question of programming in the countries. One thing that we found when it comes to the architectural structure, the fund still has challenges. And the challenges lie mostly with the policy work that hasn't been completed. So I spoke of policies just on the slide before. Here I'm going to say, yes, we have set up the system in a way that we want to have good policies, but if these policies are not well implemented, we can't have excellent work. So here we still have slow processes in the policy work that we're looking at. And we need guidance to bring about good policies, but guidance on implementation. Another aspect is the learning opportunities at institutional level. We're still finding our ways on how to set up the GCF. It's the youngest of the 4 climate funds, to look at the question of, okay, how do we do accountability? How do we learn within the organization? How do we, for instance, regard observer inputs in order to make a stronger fund? The last point, which very much links to the programming side as well, is the question of the role in the country. Here the GCF has 2 problems. One, it doesn't necessarily explain very well the role that it can take and the role that it should take. So it has a problem of clarifying its role at country level. It could be a co-financier, it could be a co-investor. There's a difference between the two. It could be a convener to bring multiple parties to the table, and it doesn't necessarily know how to do that. At the same level, when we look at programming here on the very right-hand side, we also still looking at the question of where do we come in and where do we support, and we realize that upstream programming is very, very critical, and we're not there yet. with regards to our program. And that brings me to a question in the middle. So the GCF is not investing directly in the projects, so it doesn't implement the projects on the ground. It is investing and funding the agents, the entities that will work on the ground, very similar to others. Here, the biggest question is access. And the access, to bring this in three questions here, it's all about partnership, because we can't work on our own. We have to have good partners. But now the question is, how do we engage with these partners? So we haven't got a clear vision on how to use all the different partners that we've got accredited. Second, we don't know how to then use these partners in some of the instances, so how to get direct access entities on the ground that would help us implement projects that are closer to the communities versus others. And lastly, we're also looking forward into the future. We're not necessarily ready to take on the partners that we need and reach out to the partners that we need for future programming. Which in conclusion gets me to the very right-hand side, to the lower part there. When we talk about results and implementation on the ground, we are struggling to get the right partners on the ground and fitting the needs as well as what we can provide. And it then translates also into problems of, can we learn from what our partners are implementing in order to build back better in the future. And here what we're saying is we should stop as a fund to look so much on results and pivot towards learning to really understand what do we need to bring in terms of design and program design. So now these are the key findings. If I could just get the next slide, and which is the last slide. I know I'm a little bit slow. I've always been asked to wrap it up quickly, so I bring you only a couple of points here, which will re-emphasize the points that I've just been making. So what we said is, there's a menu of different things that climate funds should look at. One of the key things is you need to be very strategic and very intentional about what you do, right? And that's, you see here where we say we need to be very clear on the strategy that we have to bring forward. The second one is you need to be also very intentional at country level. We've just been hearing, we're here as climate funds. The climate funds as global level are talking to each other, but it doesn't necessarily translate into coherence and complementarity on the ground in the countries that we're in. The third point, you've heard me say partnerships is key to success. Again, here we need to look at accreditation and access. How are we improving this? We're not there yet. We're not bringing the people to the table. And the very last 2 points here on improving our operations. One thing that we found, of course, is that the fund is still a little bit lengthy in its processes, and with the lack of guidance and in policies that I've mentioned before, it brings about this problem. And how do we engage with the partners that we need? We often need the private sector, and the private sector looks on a different model. The private sector looks at predictability, at flexibility in its approaches, and efficient and quick processes of decision making. That's not what there's still some room for improvement at the fund. Again, let me just make that very strong argument. We need to pivot towards learning so we can build better programs. It's not about results for the fund. It should be about how do we learn. So thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for this presentation and for sharing with us the findings from the GCF's second performance review, and also some of the recommendations with regards to access to finance, the institutional architecture. And we very clearly heard your call for this pivot to learning and evaluation, which is why we're here, I think. And with this, I will hand over to our second speaker, Neeraj. Please share with us your findings from the GEF side.
Hello, everybody. GEF was established in 1991 to support various environmental projects that address challenges related to biodiversity, climate change, land degradation, international waters. It has now evolved into a family of trust funds, several of which support activities that address climate change. In terms of support, we have provided about $23 billion, of which $9 billion is for climate change related activities. In terms of strategies, we are guided by the guidance provided by the UNFCCC, the national circumstances, and also the cost considerations. So those are the driving forces as to what we want to do and how we operate within the climate space. Areas of GEF support, we tend to address gaps in policies, legal frameworks, regulatory frameworks. We support capacity development in recipient countries. And we also support piloting of projects and programs that have a potential for application and wider adoption, especially for green technologies and associated infrastructure. Next slide, please. Since GEF has been operating since 1991, it has a big portfolio of completed projects. About 730 projects have been completed. And these have been covered through several evaluations that have gone beyond the climate change related benefits, but also examined what all other benefits are these projects and activities generating. Next slide, please. These are some of the benefits that are often reported in these evaluations. One set of benefits relate to the economic and financial space. Then other set of benefits relate to improved work conditions and health benefits. Then some projects that address, that are focused on communities, governance structures, they have benefits related to cohesion. Several projects that are about biodiversity conservation, forestry management, and LULUCF, these also generate benefits related to access to food sources and medicinal plants. Several projects have also reported gender empowerment. I will give you an example of it later on. Then land tenure, security, safety and security. I mean, these are the kind of benefits that come out of these evaluations. Next slide, please. Now, I briefly touch upon mechanisms through which these benefits are being achieved. Within the urban, taking urban example, urban poor as an example, and I focus more on how different activities have addressed needs of urban poor. So GEF supported the BRT bus rapid transit interventions in over 50 cities because these tend to be used more by the by the urban poor. And this is in comparison to other transit, say, technologies, approaches that could have been promoted. So this is one clear example where this mechanism, that who is using the resource that you are developing, comes into fore. Then there are other examples in the urban space, like nature-based sewage treatment in poor neighborhood. In Recife, GEF has supported a nature-based sewage treatment where an old urban municipal dump was converted into a nature-based sewage treatment plant, which has opened, which is now also being used as a public park, and has created a safe space for the community to come and operate, along with capturing the nutrients through the plants. So another example is municipal e-rickshaws driven by women. In Guntur in India, GEF supported e-rickshaws are being deployed, 220 of them, and these are supported with electricity generated from floating solar power panels. And then what's new here is the women garbage collectors, Safai Mitras, they were trained in driving these e-rickshaws, and now they are able to drive them, and their drudgery, which was involved in pushing the hand-driven carts for garbage collection and movement or transit. So that part has been taken care of. So these are examples of how these mechanisms are delivering other benefits in addition to addressing climate change. Next slide, please. One way to know how how these projects are targeting different benefits is to also look at their M&E plans, the indicators they have included in their M&E plans. And we mapped it for a sample of projects as part of our ongoing M&E work. And what we found was, in addition to climate action, you can see several other SDGs are covered in these projects. So as projects report about what they are doing, what they want to track as the results, you can clearly see that climate change projects are hitting many areas, many development themes, and this particular group of projects skews more towards capacity development and transparency-related interventions. So you may find even more richer, coverage when you come to interventions which address investments and, say, sustainable cities and stuff like that. Next slide, please. So I leave you with some concluding thoughts. What we find is many of the climate change projects have delivered benefits, but there is low intentionality. So in terms of the benefits that are reported in the terminal evaluation reports, the evaluations that are conducted after completion of these interventions, the number of benefits that are reported are way more than what have been explicitly mentioned or expected at the onset. So some of it could be that these benefits were not known when it was being designed, or another could be that these are not explicitly pursued as far as project is concerned. So there is low intentionality there. Then what you also find is, although project M&E frameworks are, include various indicators that address multiple benefits, other socioeconomic benefits, there is very little consistency across projects in terms of how to aggregate these, how to report in terms of value for money. So that's very challenging. So one thing that can be done is using SDGs as a guidance. Some convergence needs to be there on how these benefits are addressed in different climate change projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niraj, for this presentation and for introducing how the GEF-supported programs not only deliver climate benefits, but also all these other co-benefits related to sustainable development goals. And I think I speak for everyone if I say these examples that you shared were really, really interesting, and also some of the challenges related to the tracking that is happening, the aggregating of the results and the evaluation reports and so on. And I know we're also going to speak more about the challenges later. For now, I would like to pass over to Neha, and we're looking forward to hearing from you about the perspective from the climate investment funds.
Thanks so much, Bianca, and thank you to the speakers before me. Andres, of course, expanding on the relationship between climate and development at the portfolio level and the importance of thinking of both. And Neeraj, I really did appreciate the examples that you gave that were specific on how these goals look in reality. I'm from the Climate Investment Funds. If I could have the next slide, please. Just to briefly introduce the Climate Investment Funds to you, the Climate Investment Funds is one of the largest climate funds in the world, with pledges close to $12 billion. We have operations in 70 developing countries and close to 400 projects across a range of different mitigation and adaptation programs and challenges. We operate our investments through 6 multilateral development banks. Next slide, please. So a few years ago, we started thinking about, we know that climate and development are linked, but we wanted to assess how our climate investments had fared on development outcomes, because this wasn't something that we were tracking proactively or consistently or systematically across the portfolio. So we commissioned an evaluation of development impacts from CIF investments, looking across our energy resilience, forestry, energy access portfolio and projects. So we wanted to know, what is the evidence that these two goals come together? How can we strengthen the case for more climate finance by proving that these are linked? And how do we enable decision makers to make more informed decisions when they're, and sort of disprove the false dichotomy between climate and development, because we knew that they're strongly linked. So with that purpose and related key questions in mind, we commissioned out an evaluation that involved a secondary information review, so looking at literature across the board to understand those links. We looked at case studies. We developed 14 case studies from our own projects in the SIF portfolio, and we also looked at ex ante and ex post modeling methods. So how do you model, for example, potential health impacts, economic value added through input-output models, or jobs created both directly and indirectly. So we used various sort of mixed methods approach to answer that question we had in mind about development impacts. Next slide, please. And I'm going to highlight 3 macro overarching lessons or insights that came from that very broad evaluation work. The first insight is that it is really important to understand what development impacts you're aiming at, to think of it in the beginning or as you're planning your investments. So it's possible to attain both climate and development impacts, but you can't take something for granted. Just because it's a climate investment doesn't mean it'll necessarily have net benefits to the communities in which it's located. This requires deliberate planning and effort. So it's important to classify and understand the potential development impacts. Once you've decided which development impacts you're aiming for, and we're calling this a backcasting approach, you would then work backwards. So it's a theory of change or backcasting approach where you work then backwards and figure out what is the impact pathway that you need to follow to attain those development impacts. My next slide will demonstrate this. So, but if you could stay on that previous slide, please. If you could stay on that previous. There we go. And the last one I wanted to say is that we, in the team, started calling some development impacts super DIs, and then that stuck and went into the evaluation report. But the reason we started calling some impacts super development impacts is because attaining these and planning for these led to some synergistically higher levels of outcomes later on. And these included, for example, a focus on capacity building, skills development, market development, and gender and social inclusion. So in our books, these are super DIs that should be part of all or most investments. Next slide, please. This is to demonstrate how we did that classification. So through secondary literature review, we first tried to understand what could be the potential development impacts across social, economic, environmental, and market development benefits. This was a really helpful exercise, and I appreciate, Neeraj, you were talking about the SDGs. We started with the SDGs first, actually. We wanted to see whether the SDGs would provide a complete list of potential development impacts, but we found it incomplete for our purposes because there were others, or there were different levels of impacts that we really wanted to specify. So taking the SDGs as a starting point, we then classified them into 60 different potential development impacts from climate investments, and this is what that list looks like. Next slide, please. Here's an example of that backcasting approach. So we developed different case studies and tried to understand how our projects may have realized development impacts. This is the example of utility scale renewable energy generation in Thailand. And it's a utility scale wind project. And you'll see that we try to build the theory of change out, looking at what the investments will cause at the first level, what will it result in terms of initial development impacts, and then what will ultimately follow. So in this case, for example, we saw there was market development benefits. It led to a lot of local employment. I think it was about 700 construction jobs and about 38 permanent jobs. There was a lot of indirect and direct job and economic value benefits. We also saw that there were livelihood benefits for the farmers that had lent their land for these utility scale wind projects. They were earning now more than they were in previous cassava plantations. And of course, there were health benefits, and we estimated those health benefits to about 1.45 million USD dollars saved due to saving in health costs later on due to air pollution related diseases. If you click again, you'll be able to see highlighted what we were calling the super DIs. And these super DIs meant that if we invested in market development upfront, and the way that this happened here was through concessional loans and first mover risks that the CIF money, that the Climate Investment Fund's money took on, later led to actually large-scale private development of utility-scale wind in Thailand funded through the domestic market. And that, again, led to further health benefits and all of the other benefits that I spoke about. So we thought market development is a super DI in this and many of the other examples that we looked at in our evaluation. Next slide, please. So everything that I spoke about, we published in different ways because it's quite a large body of work and it's very detailed and specific. And because it doesn't just look at energy, it looks at resilience, it looks at forestry, it looks at agriculture, adaptation, and so on. So this is just to give you an idea of the publications that you can access. There's the actual evaluation report. There are actually two separate documents. There's the report document and the case studies. But there's also a summary brief that looks across all the publications, and it's shorter to read, easier to read. And there's also a workbook. So we developed a workbook with the intention that if any of you are looking to develop your programs and think about development impacts first, where would you start? And this workbook gives you a step-by-step process to think about climate and development impacts. Next slide. I think that was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neha, for this. Is this my... Can you hear me? Great. Thank you very much, Neha, for this great presentation. And I really loved also your message that there's this false dichotomy on the project level between maybe climate and development impacts, and that tracking them and assessing them more systematically can also make a case for more ambitious climate finance commitments. Even though they happen, they might not happen automatically. So there is planning and effort needed. And I loved learning about the super development impacts. And I think we will pick them up later as well. And for now, I will hand over to our last but not least speaker. Vlad, please share with us the perspective from the Adaptation Fund Evaluation Unit.
Thank you. Thank you, Bianca. Thank you, and very good afternoon. My name is Vlad Arnaudov, and I'm the coordinator of the Secretariat of the AF Turk. So I'm the lucky one who has actually the clicker, so I'll control the slides myself. But this was not intentional. Before I dive into the presentation, let me just introduce very briefly the Adaptation Fund and the Technical Evaluation Group. As most of you have probably heard, the Adaptation Fund was established as part of the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms to finance adaptation activities in the most vulnerable countries. Under the current system, it is serving also the Paris Agreement. And the Technical Evaluation Reference Group of the Adaptation Fund is part of the big family, but it is an independent advisory group of senior evaluators supported by a full-time secretary that is in charge of the implementation of the evaluation framework of the fund, and it is in charge of three things: evaluation generation, evaluation utilization, and evaluation capacity building. And this was very clearly defined in our policy. So on our side, I would like to talk about three things today. And these are questions that probably you have heard over many years. So the first question is, can we separate adaptation and development? And I think some of the previous presenters already talked about this, but I'll get a little bit deeper into that. Can we, how do we measure developmental impacts within adaptation projects? And also, what do evaluation tells us about linkages between adaptation and development? So let's start from the first question. Can we separate development and adaptation? And that has been a question that everybody's been asking, I think, for the past 20 years, at least. And the answer is no, not really. Because these are the two sides of the same coin. And you can see that in a number of both climate change and developmental projects, that you have climate benefits which are linked to developmental benefits, or you can have also developmental benefits that are diminished by the impacts of climate change. So you actually have to climate proof or climate strengthen particular developmental activities in order to adapt to climate change. So when we are talking about adaptation, we talk about development. But we have to keep in mind that development and adaptation are not always the same. So sometimes you can still have developmental activities that are not really adaptation activities. And I think across the four funds, this is something that we are seeing very often, and this is something that emerged from other evaluations. In the next slides, I'll give a few examples about that. But let me go also to the second question about how do we measure developmental impact. So the Adaptation Fund has its own set of indicators against which climate impacts are measured. But if you look at those indicators, actually many of them resemble the classical developmental indicator, but they have the, I would say, climate change or adaptation flavor. Let's look at one of the core indicators, which is the number of beneficiaries. So number of beneficiaries is something that you actually see in every single developmental project, but in an adaptation project, your number of beneficiaries is actually going to be something that are beneficiaries that have adapted to climate change or have improved resilience, and a number of other indicators which capture simultaneously both the developmental side and the adaptation side. And what do evaluations tell us about those linkages? Let's look at the next few slides. So the Adaptation Fund is actually one of the pioneers looking at ex-post evaluation of adaptation activities. And it may not come to you as a surprise that every adaptation project will probably not be able to clearly demonstrate clear adaptation impact or clear adaptation benefits at the end of its implementation. You can see some signals of adaptation impacts. You can see some signals that adaptation is occurring, but you will not be able to understand whether that has been the case or not by the end of the project. So that's why we conduct within 3 to 5 years after the end of the project ex-post evaluations where we look at the sustainability and the impacts of the project. And we piloted already 4 such evaluations, and we saw some very interesting learnings. You can find the documents online. I just picked up a couple of those who are really linked to the topic today, development and adaptation. So one of the things is that it's very important, and we found it both in the evaluation we did in Ecuador and Samoa, to have full understanding of the context, climate risk, severity of impacts in the design and implementation of the project. Why is that? On one side, you need that because you want to make sure that your adaptation impacts are generated. But you need that also from the developmental perspective, because if you do not get this correctly, actually you may end up with maladaptation, or you may end up with negative developmental impacts because your investment is not bringing what you originally planned through the project design. So it's very important to look at this part. There is also the need for plans for operation, management, maintenance, and transfer of transferred assets. And this is about the sustainability side, but this is both a climate change and a developmental issue as well, because we come on board, we invest in projects. These projects are there, we're there for 5 years, and then the project has to be transferred. And if the project is not transferred, owned, and properly managed, actually all the impacts that we are trying to generate, they will not materialize. And that will be both on the developmental side and the climate side. So I'm trying to deliver the same message that these things go side in side. And it's also important to talk about capacity gaps, integrate local communities, and by supporting them in climate change, their climate change efforts, you're actually supporting their developmental efforts as well. And we also conducted 3 thematic evaluations. I'll very briefly go through them, one on innovation, on accreditation, and scalability. And when we looked at innovation on the climate change space, a lot of the innovative part or the innovation part was really innovation from a developmental perspective and from a climate change perspective. Again, you are not able to separate those 2 parts in your work. And on the accreditation side, when we look at well, the Adaptation Fund, similar to the GCF, works through a partnership network. Many of the agencies that are our implementing entities are actually developmental agencies in their host countries. So when we work with them, we are helping them build additional climate change capacity, climate finance capacity, in addition to their developmental capacity. And the same goes for scalability. And I think it appeared in some of the previous presentations that the projects that we invest in eventually can be taken over by the government or by the private sector, and they can be scaled up. And this is not going to be supporting only climate change action and adaptation, but it is also going to support the development in the country. So the key message I wanted to deliver here is really that adaptation and climate change, they go hand in hand, and we see this in evaluations, we see this in the way the projects are designed. And I expect that maybe like 10 years from now, we'll probably stop talking about development and adaptation separately, but all developmental projects eventually are going to be climate change projects, because this is the path on which we are moving. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vlad. And thank you for highlighting how, especially for climate change adaptation, climate and development are really extremely linked and even two sides of the same coin, and how is even if not properly taken into account on the level of project design, there can actually be negative impacts for development, impacts through in the form of maladaptation. So I think this message is well taken. And I would now like to ask one follow-up question to each of you before we also then take one or two questions from the audience. Andreas, we have now heard from Neha that actually gender equality and social inclusions are the super development impacts. And I know that the second performance review from the GCF has actually touched upon how the GCF programming includes those. So based on your findings, how will the GCF strengthen this further in the next strategic plan?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Excellent point. From the perspective of the GCF, I'd like to leave you with two aspects there. The GCF is very intentional about its gender sensitivity, if not to say even its gender transformative actions. So the GCF has not only included a toolkit for the project developers to understand how to build in gender aspects, it also now requires all the projects to have a gender action plan. So it really tries to actively consider how can we bring different parts of the community, in this regard the gender aspect, to the table when we do climate projects. Now, from the evaluation perspective, and I really liked that Neha brought us closer to question how we evaluate projects. I've heard it as well from Vlad. We've also looked at a couple of projects at the GCF, and we're working together with 23 projects at the moment, where we're trying to establish a real-time and learning-oriented window to look at what is the GCF bringing to the table. Again, as my earlier answer was, we need to pivot away from results, from annual results management and annual reporting results towards learning. And what we have looked at in the impact evaluations is at exactly that point. So we've just completed our first impact evaluation from one of the first projects at the GCF in Malawi, where we looked at climate information systems and how smart climate informations are bringing much needed climate action to the ground. And here, in particular, the gender component has been very, very successful. So we looked at these the particular co-benefits that we brought with the projects, and we can clearly say that the involvement of women has been very, very much seen there in order to read the climate information, be trained on how to read climate information, and bring that closer to the farmers, so they can adopt and manage their actions in view of climate change. One thing that I want to leave us with is the only thing that we're still missing is the question of how long-lasting would such an effect be. And I think my previous speakers have spoke to this. The issue that we have in climate is that most of the actions compared to development are very, very far away, or most of them intangible to our naked eye. While in development, you may be able to see improvements in income, in wealth of a family, in reducing poverty, in other questions as well. In climate, it's not so easily visible. So what it requires from us is that we are very vigilant in using new technologies and using new methods in order to bring that about. And I'm very, very sure we're going to talk about that in a few seconds. But I think that's very relevant. And I feel here we're still missing a link on how to bring the social aspects and bring methods to the table to really effectively look at sustainability in social impacts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for highlighting this challenge. and also for sharing this example of the first evaluation from the project in Malawi and the success for gender, but yeah, really this question of the sustainability of this. And I think for this, the learnings from evaluation are also needed, right, to help us with this. Niraj, you had shared with us really well all of these examples of how in specific projects it's already happening, right? There are the development co-benefits, but also to systematically track it and aggregate it, there are all these challenges. Could you share with us from your perspective of your work and the GEF, how can we address this challenge, or how can the monitoring and evaluation systems help to address that?
Well, monitoring and evaluation happens at different levels. One at the corporate level. So Jeff works through a system of core indicators. There are 12, 13 core indicators, and out of which only one addresses other, say, socio-economic benefits, which is in terms of beneficiaries, which are gender disaggregated. Now, to think about the variety of projects that Jeff does, there's scope for inclusion of other indicators at the corporate level, so that those benefits that link up more easily with the kind of activities you undertake are pursued more explicitly. So there is scope for that at that level. Now, you don't want to burden the system too much. You don't want a laundry list of, say, hundreds of indicators that are tracked at the corporate level. So it needs to be streamlined. But then there has to be tracking of these results at the project level. And there have to be incentives for the designers of the projects and also people who review these designs to actually make sure that there are arrangements in place in the project M&E plan that actually track all the benefits, or at least the important socioeconomic benefits that are going to come out of it. So at that level, that needs to be done. Now, there also needs to be a community of practice which has some understanding of what are the kind of indicators that they will consistently rely upon to standing on that across the board. I think there would be something that we can say, we would be able to say more about the kind of results that are being achieved, how they are being achieved, and we will also be able to compare interventions across the board.
Thank you very much. This is very helpful on the indicators, how to have more incentives and maybe have a community of practice. And Neha, you had also talked to us about the drivers and also the constraints for achieving these development impacts and the tracking of this. And how do we address this low intentionality and to address these to provide more incentives, maybe, as Niraj just said.
Yeah, and I'll link that, Neeraj, to what you were saying about M&E, because I think you brought up some really important points. One of the things we found in the work that we did, and maybe there are three parts to this, is although we were trying to get to development impacts, getting to disaggregated level of the development impacts or the distributional impacts or the impacts on the most marginalized populations or the most vulnerable was still very hard, even if we were going back to visit the programs and ask or do the household surveys. So like that aspect of it was really, really difficult. The second is the net benefit. So you can find out some positive impacts and you can find out some negative, but how do you calculate the net impacts? And the third thing I'll say is net impacts over time. So we've all spoken about that it's really difficult to get to distribution analysis and net impacts, but then over time adds a complication of even trying to find the people who were impacted, or you just don't know where to find that level of information. And for that reason, I think the work that the Adaptation Fund is doing on ex post evaluation will be really illuminating. So I'm just linking sort of I may not have helped with insights and vocalize some more of the challenges, but I think the insight really is that from the Climate Investment Fund side, we work with multilateral development banks, and these are their bread and butter is development. And the fact that climate can change the status quo and take us towards this net zero journey, but in a way that we're uplifting communities and in a way that we're attaining development goals is the major motivating factor. So I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Thank you very much, and I really like this, concise message of basically the challenge of all the four funds going ahead is measuring the net benefit, net climate and development benefit over time. And you were also already linking to the Adaptation Fund. Vlad, I know that obviously the Adaptation Fund just approved its evaluation policy. So how do you think that will help with also tracking development impacts?
Thank you, Bianca. And I agree that adaptation policy is actually a pivotal moment in the work of the Adaptation Fund, because we move from the old adaptation framework to a policy where there are very clear roles and responsibilities for all participants in the evaluation process and all stakeholders of the GCF. So this includes implementing entity, it includes the secretariat, the board of the AF, as well as us as an evaluation unit. Now, the policy gives us the necessary tools to actually look in a very systematic manner into the various impacts that projects generate, and that includes both climate impacts and developmental impacts. And it also emphasizes that this is everybody's responsibility and everybody is part of the evaluative process. And why that is important in relation to development, because this will allow all the stakeholders to come together to be responsible for the data collection, be responsible for the generations and sustainability of the impact. And I'll just link it also to something that was some of the previous speakers said, that eventually the policy also talks about learning and generation. You saw in the responsibilities actually utilization of evaluation, and this is utilization of learnings, and this is something that we can feed into the future programming, and it can support both the climate and the developmental aspects. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Indeed, everyone is part of the evaluative process. And with this, I believe we can take one question from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. That's okay? Yeah. My name is Archie Rastogam with the GCF as well. Just a quick question. You spoke of how these kinds of impacts complement each other, but there have to be trade-offs as well. We're speaking of success stories here, but what can we learn from failures? What impacts don't actually go along with each other? Because one of the things we can also say is that this trying to do too much with very little money would also lead you nowhere, and some streamlining is essential. So what do you then prioritize? The narrative here seems to be that it's all at once, all together.
Thank you very much, Franck Lecoq, CRED France. I was part of the last IPCC cycle, writing a report writing one of the chapters on mitigation and development, and we found it very difficult to find in the literature, actual academic literature, some of the lessons learned from all the evaluation of the projects that you're looking at. So my question is whether there's a way to actually put some of that knowledge into more an academic form that can be swallowed by some of these processes, notably because you have now a large portfolio, so ability also to look across not just one project, but draw lessons from why. And also, is it possible to get information lessons learned from what did not work? Because often that's actually the most interesting in terms of barriers. Thank you very much.
Merci, je salue les intervenants et les organisateurs de la réunion. Do you speak French? Oh my God. Okay, I will try my bad English. I'm from Sahel, from Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and based in Burkina Faso. We are a chief observer, Tinhinan, who is a pastoralist woman organization. And I was a previous observer, but now we have a young lady there, Aisha. So I want to ask the challenge that observers have for being very good, for having very good participation at the local level, national level of implementation of projects. We raise many issues In there, the sun is the observer found our climate found of observer network. So we are also a member of the member fondateur. Voilà. So we ask many times how we can go forward on the challenge that the observer have to have some some open door and resource at the national level or sub-regional level to do more her work, to have more participation, efficient participation. I want to know where we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I apologize that we do not have a lot of time. I'll just invite a first round of responses on basically more the trade-offs, the challenges, also for participation.
Okay. Let me start, and I'll give the floor also to my other colleagues. But that's a very good question. My answer will be that if we talk about the trade-off between development and adaptation, actually the only trade-off is that if we do not consider climate risk and climate vulnerability, all of our developmental actions are going to be futile in several years. So we basically have to look at it from that perspective. That will be, to me, like the biggest trade-off that we have at the moment.
Thank you, and maybe I'll just build on that. On the first question, the evaluation also looks at unintended consequences, and that's where the conversation or trade-off comes in. But I'll change the narrative a little bit because I think it's about maximizing the potential impacts, and the trade-offs are important in trying to maximize them, but the focus on maximizing and hence not really thinking about whether you don't want one to come at the cost of the other, but you want to maximize both. And I think when you look at it in that lens of framing, sort of changes a little bit. In terms of academic literature, I mentioned the secondary literature review that we did, and that includes some papers that were published more in academic peer-reviewed journals. So I'm happy to share with you the secondary literature review that we did on development impacts. That literature review led to the development of the 60 potential development impacts from climate investments that we then classified. And then thank you for your question. We are trying to look at evaluation capacity development of observers, and we're giving them grants to do country-led evaluations. And there the focus is really on development impacts because they're really coming from the bottom up, from developing countries where development is at the forefront of the climate effort. So I'm, again, happy to speak to you after this about the availability of funding for country-led evaluations.
From Jeff's experience, we have certain examples where we can think about the trade-offs and the choices made. One example that comes to mind is of the bus rapid transit. We moved there because our earlier interventions related to, say, the metro lines and train-related metro systems, we found that they were not being used by the poorest. They were by the more affluent class. They required a lot of upfront investments. So the choice was very clear that we want to go towards approaches that deliver more to the urban poor. So that's one clear example. Another example, like within the urban setup, is of bike lanes or bike roads. So Jeff used to support it, and then it turns out that these were being put up at places where affluent people live, not the best use of money, so we dropped it. Then within other interventions also, you can think about it. Some of it is about intentionality, like you are doing nature-based solutions, you are making parks that open up public spaces, but then you have to think about issues related to green gentrification and how to address it. So all those challenges come into play. You have to be conscious about it in terms of strategies that you adopt, what you want to promote, and then also at the project level, how specific interventions can be improved.
Okay, really quickly, just a few thoughts on the trade-offs. One of the things that the GCF has done from a policy perspective is obviously to say unintended consequences need to be a criteria for evaluations. So that was one that was done there to just clearly say, okay, we need to consider this on all of our evaluations at all levels. The second point is when we look at the unintended consequences, we also obviously asking ourselves the question: what does the private sector do? The private sector usually uses a portion of its money to just as seed money, just to try out, to fail as well in a safe environment. That's something that the GCF could be looking into, has not done yet, but could be looking into in the future. From the perspective of my French colleague here on the literature, we often are faced by this in climate. There's very little literature that tells us what works and what doesn't in terms of impacts. What we have done at the GCF is we have looked at this from the perspective of global evidence. So when we want to venture out in an area where we have not necessarily all the information at a funds level, we're looking at the global evidence. So we've done over the years about 11 evidence studies, global evidence reviews, that look at an evidence gap map. So basically looking at all the intervention types that you can think of, all the outcome categories you can think of, and then you look at these cells to identify, do we have any knowledge of what works and what doesn't? And what we realized in climate change adaptation, for instance, is there were huge gaps. There were huge differences. So we have sub-Saharan Africa with lots of evidence, lots of documented evidence out there. In Latin America, not at all. There's very little evidence. When we looked at the different sectors, we realized in forestry, in fisheries, there's lots of evidence. In water, there's very, very little. Credible impact studies that would tell us what works and what doesn't. And then when we looked at the outcome areas, we realized that, of course, we go at the outcome of the adoption of an agricultural method, lots of studies, the studies of how to address stresses, lots of studies out there. But when you then come to the enabling environment that you need, for instance, it's an institutional environment, enabling environment, as well as the ecological enabling environment. Again, very, very few studies that tell us what works and what doesn't. In conclusion, what we need to think about as climate funds here is, what do we do about this? Are we funding areas where we have gaps, or are we funding areas where we have a lot of information? That's something to discuss for the climate funds from the project development perspective. Perhaps also a discussion worth having with the bilateral donors, because sometimes these funds could be used to look at these gaps and address, or to further knowledge that we have already in certain areas. I keep it at that. Thank you. Engagement. We should never forget the engagement and the participation. Here, one thing to say from the GCF's perspective, we've done an environmental and social safeguards assessment a couple of years ago. And what we realized with most of the projects is that this is indeed a problem at design stage, as well as in the implementation of the projects. That civil society organizations are not necessarily, or observer organizations are not necessarily able to continuously engage with the project. Our recommendations at the time was to say, okay, how can we make it obligatory, that engagement? And we realized that the fund, the GCF, has a lot of policies, but it does miss a policy on stakeholder engagement. That's mine.
I am told that we can take a last question.
Thank you very much. My name is Kofi Kumasi. I'm from Togo. 2 questions very quickly. I would like to know, how do the climate funds collaborate with MDBs in order to have a common framework indicator to measure development impacts into climate projects, as well as climate impacts into development projects? My second question is, if we just focus on development impacts into specific projects, it seems that we will not be able to tackle how we have to mainstream climate change into the whole process of development. So my question is, how can climate funds could support countries in order to mainstream climate change into their development policies, so that we could be able to conduct the development process as a whole in an integrated and holistic approach? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this important question on how to mainstream climate into development. And Neha volunteered to answer the question. Please go ahead.
I volunteered because I have a good example. First, excellent questions. Thank you so much for asking them. I wanted to share the case of Zambia and the work we did there. So in Zambia, what we did is we provided technical support to create an enabling environment to have an interministerial body coordinating across different departments and ministries on climate. That work eventually led to climate being mainstreamed in national development plans, but more importantly, budget being allocated to the different departments to mainstream climate in all activities. That includes health and education, and this was on the adaptation side. So each new public plan or program had to be evaluated through this Excel-based mechanism on whether it addressed climate adaptation and resilience impacts. So that's one positive example on how this was done, because what you're raising is a really, really good point. I also appreciated your linking the co-benefits from the MDB side and the climate, and how when we initially started looking at distributional impacts, on the World Bank side, which is one of our implementing agencies, they call it climate co-benefits, and that's one of their co-metrics. But we wanted to move away from the co-benefit side and say the false dichotomy language that I used before, that nothing is a co-benefit, these are all necessary benefits, and these are all co-indicators. So what you said reminded me of that early conversation when we started looking at development impacts. So you can look, climate is calling development a co-benefit, and development is calling climate a co-benefit, when actually these are just benefits. So I wanted to add.
I think that's a very good closing statement, unless okay, perfect. Then thank you very much for attending this event, for all of your questions, and please join me in thanking our 4 panelists from the 4 climate funds.